walking down the long hallway of a week. It's the first day of the week. It is December 6th, 2020. And just as a grim reminder of where we are, I suppose. But we have passed a milestone, and I will tell you that in just a second. I am Dr. Ray Mitch, your host. If this is your first time visiting to listen to the Psych Monologues, welcome. You are most graciously welcome here for the next 25 or 30 minutes as the name implies, monologue about some issue that has come to my attention that I think is relevant to our relationships with each other and everything else. But the Psych Monologues itself is a podcast devoted to exploring our journey toward wholeness and living in truth and grace, all the while embracing this profound mystery of our relationship with God, with ourselves, and with each other. So we passed a milestone just a couple days ago that I wanted to share with you as it's very exciting and completely unexpected. I was not looking for this to happen. Actually, I didn't even know that it was a thing, if you want to put it that way. But we passed this milestone where I got an email from the team at Podbean and congratulating me and the Psych Monologues podcast with passing the milestone of having 1,000 downloads. That is absolutely stunning and amazing. We got our very own badge, which we can put on the website to indicate that we have entered some very low hanging air, I imagine, because there are people that have a lot bigger download rates than we do. But hey, it's important to us. I've crossed that threshold, and like I said, it was completely unexpected, very amazing. And the fact, to me at least, the fact that we crossed that threshold in 8 months is nothing short of amazing. So let's see what we can do in the next 8 months, which would put us somewhere in August. And that means we will have gotten through for me at least, the spring semester and all the things that come to my attention as I'm teaching, and then the summer, and we'll see where we are by that time. And I would hope that you'd be kind enough to pass this along if there's something relevant and interesting that you find in my ramblings, rantings, and ravings that can be useful to the people around you. Please share it with somebody, and I'll talk a little bit about how to subscribe or where to find us at the end of the podcast. Well, as far as today is concerned, I want to talk about something that I have I've been reminded of, let's put it that way, over the last few weeks. And in the context in which we're operating with living with this pandemic, living on the edge of accumulated losses and all that comes along with it, the issue that I want to spend some time talking about tonight is the difference between having needs and being needy. And this is one that I've talked a lot about. I can just imagine the people out there that are listening who have been or are my students, and their eyes rolling up in their head to such a degree that they lose consciousness, because this is one of those issues that tend to interfere with our embrace of just simply being human. And so let me define my terms first, which is something that I like to do, so that we can make sure that we're talking on the same page or from the same sheet of music or whatever metaphor you want to work with. And there are two different things that I want to two different systems, if you will, that I want to explain before we even get into talking about the differences here between having needs and being needy. And that is, so what exactly is a need anyway? I mean, a lot of times I might say, or I might hear one of my girls say, I need chocolate. And while that may be a felt emotional need, that is not a physiological need. Their body doesn't need it. Oftentimes our weight reminds us of how little we need it. So what is the difference between a need or a want or a desire or any of those things? And usually, in a lot of cases, even in our interactions with each other, somebody will say like that, I need chocolate. And you say, well, you don't need chocolate. You want chocolate, but you don't need it. And it's like, well, it's a matter of opinion because the claws come out. And it's like, this is fighting words. You don't do that. And, and as the phrase goes, which I have learned well in in living in a household of women, discretion is the better part of valor and survival, actually. So that being said, there are two different systems that, like I said, I want to explain to you. One is very common. A lot of people know about all the work that Abraham Maslow has done around identifying what he referred to as the hierarchy of needs. And the way his system works is that usually we function on the lower needs, the deficit needs, and once we get those met, then we tend to drift up in terms of getting these other needs met. So his hierarchy, it's a pyramid, and it starts with physiological needs, air, water, food, etc., to safety needs, security needs, to belongingness and love, which are often referred to or grouped together as psychological needs, belongingness and love, and then esteem, and then at the very top of the pyramid is what's referred to as self-actualization or self-fulfillment. So that was his original formulation of this pyramid that worked its way up from physiological needs to psychological needs to self-fulfillment needs. Later in his work, he criticized his own work and said there's actually a sixth one that he wanted to add, and he referred to it as transcendence, which is reaching beyond to something bigger than ourselves, and he often referred to it as reaching for the infinite, and that's transcendence. Now, the problem with this is that with his formulation is that there are lots of people that actually do things that threaten their physiological and safety needs and are reaching and actually in service to something transcendent, like God, for example, in his mission in the world, acting redemptively, bringing all people to a knowledge of Christ and salvation through him, and that they'll put their physiological and safety needs at risk, which wouldn't fit his model. So all that to be said, Maslow is saying, well, look, these are needs that are common across all humanity. We all need to eat and sleep and be safe and feel a sense of belonging. We all need that. And that's part of his idea around needs. Okay, that's Abraham Maslow. This is a short lesson. I won't belabor it, but a short lesson in psychology and needs and all that kind of stuff. The other one is one that you may not have heard nearly as much about, one that I have a particular affinity to, that was developed by a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. William Glasser. He developed a model of therapy called reality therapy. It was built on what he used was control theory, and that control theory then moved into what he refers now today as choice theory, built on human freedom. And I was very much enamored with this early in my career, even early in my graduate training, because it was one of the few therapy models that actually asked people to evaluate their own behavior in light of what they wanted. And so that was his approach. He identifies what he calls 5 basic needs, and I think there's probably some more validity in here with how he talks about it, and that is survival, which would fit into physiological and safety needs of Maslow, love, belonging, and connection, which would fit into some of the psychological needs that Maslow was talking about, power, significance, and competence, freedom and autonomy, and then finally fun and learning. And fun and learning is never mentioned really as a need, but Glasser was convinced that we need to participate in recreation or recreation, if you want to put it that way, and having just fun and the intrinsic motivation of learning something. And so it depends on how you're going to approach needs, but I think the safe thing to assume based on just these two systems alone is that needs exist because we are human. And it's just a matter of how you divide them up or define them. But the fact that needs exist is not rocket science here. We all know that. And the thing is that oftentimes we don't really differentiate a need from a want. Although when you really press into it, I think pretty much everybody agrees that we all need to survive. We all need the belonging, etc. So those are needs that are unequivocal. When they're not met, then something pretty dramatic happens to the individual, whoever that might be. So that's kind of the basics. I wanted to get that on our radar before I go much further about what needs are and how we're going to define them. Okay. Now, where we go to from here is when we talk about having needs versus being needy, this whole issue revolves around our unwillingness to admit or accept our needs and what drives that unwillingness of ours to admit or accept we have needs. And what it's driven by is image or perception management. Now, what I mean by that is our unwillingness to accept or speak what our needs are is driven by our desire to not be perceived as needy. See, it is not the same thing as having needs as being needy. And so our unwillingness to admit or accept the fact that we have needs is oftentimes driven by, I don't want someone to think that I'm needy. So I'm not going to speak these things, and I'll deny them. And oftentimes it leads to us being isolated and alone and longing for someone to love us enough to know what our needs are without us having to say it. Now, interestingly enough, what you find in a lot of families, and even in some relationships where people will say, well, if I have to tell you, then it doesn't matter then. Because if you love me, you would know what I need. And I shouldn't have to say that. But the problem is I don't really own anything I don't speak. And so what happens with this denial of our needs is this isolation and being alone, and we blame other people for not loving us enough to know what our needs are. And that's where the problem comes in, because then, of course, the seed bed of resentment is seeded, and resentment continues to grow, and we continue to play this tug of war with the person because we just want them to know what we need without us having to say it. And why? Because if we say it, we become vulnerable, and if we become vulnerable, we're going to get hurt. And our highest value here is to not get hurt. Now, I think it needs to be said that having needs doesn't mean we're weak. It just means we're human. And our unwillingness to admit we're human is, for one thing, emotionally fatal. And secondly, it is relationally superficial or leads to superficiality in our relationships. I've often said, we wonder why our relationships are so shallow, and half of it is partly because of our unwillingness to admit that we need anything. So we condemn our humanness and thereby depend on others just knowing rather than us accepting and voicing, owning our own needs and stating them for what they are. So we have this tug of war between the needs that we experience internally however you want to divide them up, whether it's by Maslow or Glasser or anybody else that you want to define it as, a lot of times people will say, well, physiological needs count, but psychological or emotional needs really don't. And that's not how it's experienced at all in any way, shape, or form. And so accepting the fact that we have needs and finding a voice to articulate what those needs are to the people around us is the basis of depth in relationships. Now, that requires me to take some time to identify what of my needs I'm experiencing, because there are lots of times where we're out of touch with that. We don't really monitor it because it's almost as if we're counting on somebody noticing it in us before we do, and then obviously we're important enough because they're actually monitoring it for us. Okay, so the big question oftentimes that I get is, so how do I avoid being needy? Now, again, let me back up for just a second. It's fascinating to me, isn't it, that I make the distinction between having needs, which is a description of state. All right, it's how the state of my being. I have needs. I'm human. Versus being needy, which is actually a description of my being, when in fact it isn't at all. Because being needy is a strategy for feeling loved. So it really comes down to, if we're going to say, how do I avoid being needy? It really does come down to motivation in a lot of ways, because ultimately the statement of my need is the very thing that puts me at risk, at least in my mind, of being perceived as needy. So what's my motivation? Is my motivation to communicate my need to another person that is important to me, who's in my life, who has been a part of my life for a long period of time, and communicating my need and making it known to them, and maybe even getting specific enough to ask them to meet that need? Now, what that means is ultimately, hopefully, there's enough honesty in our relationship that the person can say, well, I may not be able to do all of that, but I sure can do some of it. But see, that's what we're trying to avoid, right? The idea of being needy is it about the outcome I want, or is it about the communication of my needs that is important? See, if the goal is the communication of my needs, then I've fulfilled that. I have said what I need to somebody else. But if it's the outcome and you're trying to secure the person's presence or avoid their absence or abandonment, then we run the risk of falling into a needy pattern. Versus saying, I could really use and I need just your affirmation and support right now. That's all I need. I don't need anything else. And the person says, I'm in, I can do that, let's move forward. Or they can say, I'm in no position to be able to do that. And see, that's the answer that we're trying to avoid. And when I try to manage how somebody responds to me, I fall into a manipulative and controlling pattern. And then when they do it, I discount it because I've extracted it out of them. So it's about motivation. It's also about accepting no for an answer. Now, this is a bigger issue of freedom. Because if I make my needs known to somebody and they say no, and I say then my needs don't count, then I probably was fishing rather than actually communicating. But if I'm willing to accept no for an answer and understand that this is a point in time, this is not a trend over time, then that doesn't predict the next time I ask. I'll see a lot of times when I get no for an answer, usually I'll say, well, I'm never going to ask that again. But see, that too is manipulative and controlling. I'm just saying, I'm never going to give you a chance to say no to me again. So therefore, I will shut down all of my needs. I will deny the things that I feel. I will deny that I have these needs at all. Therefore, you won't have an opportunity to say no again. And that is part of what is fatal to our relationships. And it also perpetuates superficiality, because we're not going to take any risks. And with no risks, there's no depth. There's no trust either. So it's about motivation. It's about accepting no for an answer. And it also is about being specific about what your needs are. Because oftentimes the people that would be identified as being needy tend to be vague and non-specific, hoping the other person will figure out what they need and respond accordingly. And that's what you will notice as I'm describing this, is this whole idea of being needy is manipulation. And as I've been known famously or infamously saying, control and trust can't coexist. And falling into a needy pattern is about controlling and manipulating the outcomes to be what I want them to be. But then I get the outcome I want, and then I dismiss it because I've just manipulated to get it. And so the person really hasn't exercised any decision or choice. They have just done what I've wanted them to do, and I can just toss that out because I got what I wanted. But see, that's the rub of freedom, because freedom isn't freedom if the person can't say no as well as yes. It's not freedom. But that also means that if I'm going to cultivate freedom, that also means that when they say yes, it means yes, and it's even more powerful because they've chosen me. They have chosen on my behalf. Because no is an acceptable, not a preferable, but is an acceptable answer. The last thing I'll mention to you, so it's about motivation, it's about accepting no for an answer, it's about being specific about our needs, but it's also about exercising good boundaries and discernment. Because at some point in time, in some relationships, not all of them, but when others are honest enough to say that they can't step up, and they do that consistently over time, then perhaps I need to fall back and regroup and evaluate that maybe it's time to go our separate ways. The structure of our relationship and everything was around a season in time or a season of life that we were going through together, and it's just time to go our separate ways. The other aspect of this idea of discernment is not about judging people's character, but it is about discerning the true nature of the person I'm in relationship with. And ultimately, and this is a whole nother discussion because we can talk about safe people, and I would refer you to the book Safe People by Henry Cloud and John Townsend, a great book. But we need to learn to discern the nature of people that we're in relationships with, because not everybody is going to be able to step up and do what we need for them to do in the relationship. And I need to discern that. I'm not judging anybody. I'm not saying that they're condemned, or I'm not saying that they are worthless, evil people. I'm not saying that. But I am wrestling with the reality of who they are and what they can do and what they have done, and be able to make some conclusions about that. And what that ends up turning into, in a sense, is having the boundaries to say, yeah, I need to keep my distance with this person. I need to be wary of them. I need to be realistic in my expectations of what they can and can't do. Now, one thing that has to be said, and I always say it whenever I'm talking about this safe people subject, is not, safe people are not safe people 100% of the time. We can't be. We're human. We make mistakes. We're fallen. We're going to make those mistakes, and at times we're going to be so stressed out, or whatever the reason is, that we're really not able to be safe at that point in time. But safe people are over time consistently safe. even though there are times that they may not be. And so that's where discernment comes in. It requires an understanding of the nature of the people that we're in relationship with. So, how do we differentiate between having needs and being needy? First, we have to differentiate. Having needs is synonymous with being human. So it's not a matter of do I have needs or don't I? No, I as long as I'm human, I have needs. And you can, like I said, you can divide them up however you want. So having needs is a statement of fact. Being needy is a strategy for relationship that oftentimes leads to superficiality and control and manipulation and things of that sort. Just because I have needs doesn't make me needy. And just because I communicate what my needs are does not make me needy either. We are not going to negate our needs by denying them and saying they don't exist or they're unimportant. If our needs were personified, they would say, I don't care what you think about that. I don't care whether you accept that I exist or not. I will continue to operate as I've always operated. So having needs is being human. And the question then becomes, if we're going to be in relationship, are we going to be in relationship as humans that have needs and limitations and deficits and things that ultimately, if I accept and state what those are, it makes me vulnerable. I grant you that. But I am not going to have connection and a sense of belonging without vulnerability. Those two always go together. Trust and risk and vulnerability go together. Control, manipulation, and superficiality go together. Depth comes from trust and risk. That doesn't mean it won't at times not work, but that is not a proof that it is the wrong thing. And that's a whole nother, again, like I said, kind of whole other issue. So having needs is a reality, and we vary to what degree, to varying degrees, to which around which we accept them. Being needy is a strategy versus being vulnerable and authentic is also a strategy. And allowing and supporting and encouraging freedom and choice in relationship is where all of that comes from, or what feeds into it. So enough of a brief psych lesson and some other reflections, thoughts, maybe a little intrusive about how we tend to handle our needs or what we do with them. I encourage you to give me feedback, and I'd love to hear from you if you have other questions in regards to that. On that note, we can be found in a variety of social media platforms, including Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, and so you can interact there if you would like. In Instagram, we're at the Psych Monologues, all one word, lowercase, and Twitter at Ray Mitch, and Facebook Ray.Mitch, and LinkedIn Dr. Mitch are the four different platforms that currently we're on. I'm also, please be sure to hit the website at drmitch.com, and you can subscribe there to all the content and other things that will be coming out. And there's new material coming out. I'm doing 2 new lectures in my shame and grace class, and they will be showing up there for you to take a look at and listen to and consider. So subscribe on the website. It's the upper right-hand corner, or you can subscribe to the podcast at Podbean, raymitch.podbean.com. There's a player. We are available. This is really exciting. We're available on Spotify, on Stitcher, on iTunes, obviously Podbean, and Amazon Music. So you can find the psych monologues and a variety of modalities that you want to engage us with. And then finally, I want to mention, as I've done consistently, is if the things that I'm talking about in this podcast are hitting things that are important to you. Part of the reason that I am doing this at all is also to make you all aware of the need for us to continue to grow our scholarship program and fund for the CCU Silent Retreats that I take students on twice a year. We need to develop a larger and larger fund for the scholarship to help students be able to go. It's not cheap. It's not real expensive when you compare it to other things, but it is still not cheap, particularly when you're a college student and you're trying to make ends meet and all of that kind of stuff. So if there's things here that you've heard and it ministers to your heart and you want to partner with us to grow this scholarship fund, please do. You can go to the website, click on CCU, go down to Silent Retreats, and you can see a GoFundMe site to be able to contribute to that scholarship fund. We have another Silent Retreat coming up in spring of 2021, April 8th through the 11th. And I would be deeply appreciative and thankful and grateful for your participation in that as we continue to grow it and make it possible for students who really want to experience God in a unique way to be able to participate in that. So that is it for tonight. That was a lot. I know I packed a lot in. Thanks so much for joining me. As always, love you. Later. Bye.